Today we're going to be testing out the Creality K2 Plus to see if this is the large format multicolor printer we've all been waiting for. First, we've got to start with getting this printer out of the box, which, let me tell you, was no small feat. I should have known when there were literally unboxing instructions on the top. First thing you have to do is remove these plastic clips that hold the upper and bottom sections of the cardboard together, and then when they're gone, you can then just slip that upper part right off and reveal even more cardboard and packaging underneath. No, but really, this machine is very efficiently and securely packaged. The main difficulty came with literally everything is packed into the printer itself, and there's like no handles or anything to grab onto, and it's already a massive printer on its own, but then you're adding all of this extra weight in the inside. So once I did manage to get this printer onto a table, the first thing we need to tackle is removing some of these brackets. I have to say, I absolutely love this little toolbox that Creality includes. It's got a lot of tools and like more maintenance accessories, and the first thing that I'm using these tools for is removing some of these brackets that's holding the CFS in place. As is the case with a lot of these enclosed machines, they get packaged with parts screwed together to be more sturdy during the shipping process, and so half of the time you're actually removing more pieces than you're having to add to the machine. Both the top and the bottom bracket have 4 screws each to remove, and then the bottom bracket is also tucked underneath the CFS, so you've got to be a bit careful with sliding that out. The CFS itself is all in one piece, so you just need to remove some of that packaging, and here on the bottom you can see that open tube design, which is going to be great for possible maintenance in the future. Back inside the machine though, we've got some more foam packaging and also even more filament, which is probably why this machine weighs so much too. At the very back of the machine there is some tape and stickers to remove, and I just have to mention, I don't know what was with the adhesive on these various stickers and tape, but there are still marks on my printer from it. There are also these screw rod brackets to remove from either side as well. Next is removing the 4 screws holding the build plate down that you can see labeled by those yellow arrows. The last couple of things could be easy to miss. The first thing is removing the lens cap off of the camera, and just above that on the right hand side of the machine there is this piece of plastic to remove. But now let's get on to actually adding some parts to this printer, starting off with the screen base that gets installed with 2 bolts. The screen itself plugs into this cable that you need to feed through the entire screen base. I think it might be easier to feed it through the printer and then the screen base before installing it on the machine, but that's just my opinion, and the screen just locks in from sliding it once you have that cable installed. The next step according to the instructions is installing the external spool holder, but I'm not personally going to be installing it because I fully plan to just be using the CFS all of the time. And then it was on to this bag of tubes, which really I think this was probably the most ideal way that Creality could have gone about figuring out the packaging and instruction situation for these pieces. But before we get to any of those, we first have to start with installing this hub part onto the back of the machine, which just goes on with 2 bolts. Start out with the long PTFE tube that goes from the back of the CFS to the right side of the hub. Next was the short PTFE tube that goes from the nozzle connector to the left side of the hub. The 45cm cable goes from the hub to the left port on the back of the CFS, and the 100cm cable goes from the right port on the back of the CFS down to the bottom of the machine. And after all of that, here is what the back of the CFS and printer look like with all of the tubes connected. And that was it for printer assembly. There were still a couple of parts left in the box still. First, of course, was the external spool holder I decided to not install. You get an extra nozzle, which is a nice bonus. And in this little mystery black box, you get some various replacement parts and maintenance pieces. So you get some sort of lubricant, some connector pieces, replacement nozzle wiper pads, some sort of circuit board, and the final thing is this filament swatch deck. I'm assuming this is the first wave of colors and filaments that Creality is planning on putting their RFID system on first, but I really hope they expand because this is a pretty limiting palette. And that's everything in the box, which means we can power this machine on and start setup. It starts off with the typical set your language, time, if you want to connect it to your Wi-Fi, and then it will immediately go into the self-check test process, which includes checking that the nozzle and hotbed are heating properly, it checks a couple of the fans, and then goes into the more typical input shaping and auto bed leveling. It starts out the input shaping by doing these repetitive motions. I believe it's checking the sounds and just the motor functionality here. It never really says it's doing this, and I could understand why the look of this might be a little concerning, but not to worry, it's completely normal. But after that it went into the more typical input shaping, which is that it looks like it does nothing, but it sounds crazy. After it's finished the input shaping, it goes into its bed leveling sequence, which another unique thing this machine does is it does the bed leveling in a spiral. Normally it just does it in rows front to back, but as you can see here, it just keeps on going around. This is sped up, by the way. The self-checking process takes about 15 minutes to do the input shaping and the bed leveling. Once that's completed, it will most likely prompt you to install new firmware, which I would recommend. There's probably a bunch of bugs that it has fixed since this initial release. And that's all of the setup complete. I wanted to just showcase how when the printer is on, the CFS has a display that tells you the temperature, humidity, and which CFS unit it is if you have multiple connected, since the K2 Plus is compatible with up to 4. But now let's start actually getting something printing. I'm not going to tell you what it is yet because I think it will be way more impressive if you just see the printing process for yourself. I did decide to jump straight in though with a multicolor print using 2 filament colors, white and this very cool galaxy filament. So loaded those into the CFS. You do have to wait for one filament to finish loading into the machine before it will start pulling at the next roll. The CFS also has these bars at the top to help hold the filament rolls in place, as well as a locking lid. Now that the filament is loaded into the CFS, I'm going to go into the settings of the machine and input the type and color of both filaments. If these spools used compatible RFID tags, then this info would have been automatically read and input, but it's not difficult to do manually, and it makes it a lot easier on yourself later if the machine already knows what color is in what slot when you start to print something. The K2 Plus has a 350mm cubed build volume, and I wanted to try maxing that out as much as possible with this first print, especially since this is something I've wanted to try printing for such a long time, but no multicolor printer has been large enough to handle it, until now that is. And that is a sign, I guess we will call it, of my logo. It is just such a complex and detailed design that I knew if I had ever tried printing one before this machine existed, it just really would not have turned out very well and had all of the detail like it should have. And watching this thing print was wild. I did decide to orient it that the design would be on the bottom of the print, so seeing this machine lay down all of those white lines just flawlessly was so crazy. And just over 6 hours later, the print was complete. Flexed it off of the build plate, it actually released really easily, even though it was quite a massive print, and here are the final results. I have to say, this was a very good first impression for this machine for me because this print was incredibly impressive. The glitteriness that you see is a combination of the build plate texture on the print as well as that galaxy filament. You can see it better on the back here exactly what crazy color this filament is. But yeah, I mean, this is just such a clean print. There's really no issues with it whatsoever. The only area where you start losing a bit of that detail is in the Emphas Nest helmet text, but really it is still majority all there. You can see all of the little details. It got into the droid silhouettes in Embo, just everything, flawless print, such a cool print. I know I'm biased, but from there I knew that I absolutely needed to print a poop chute situation, some sort of waste chute and container, so I went with this one, which I didn't end up liking the chute itself whatsoever. The container was decent enough, and this is actually the time-lapse footage that this machine created on its own using the camera, and I would say really decent webcam quality for this printer. So here are the finished pieces. There's a bit of difference in texture for the filament. I think it's a combination of really cheap PLA and also some cooling differences around where those Creality logos are, and that's where you see the shinier band because it's printing slower or using slightly different cooling settings. But you know, overall, both of them pretty clean prints, even if this chute did not work whatsoever. Next, I decided to switch to a different type of filament because I also wanted to test out the auto refill feature that the CFS is supposed to have. So loaded up 2 rolls of this white PETG, and the idea is when you have 2 of the same material set in the materials menu on the machine, that when one runs out, it should automatically switch to the next one. And I knew that the pieces that I was going to be printing out of this white PETG, I was going to end up needing more than that first roll head still left on the spool. With the PETG, I wanted to print some of L337's head pieces. Since this is PETG, I went ahead and put some glue stick all over the build plate. This acts as a barrier because PETG has a habit of sticking almost too well to printer beds. So this is just what I do as a bit of a precaution so that I don't accidentally ruin any of my build plates. And the CFS did indeed seamlessly flip over to that second spool of PETG to the point that I actually have no clue at what point in the print it actually did flip to a new one. That's how smooth the transition was between the first and second spool. Again, these parts were turning out beautifully. I know white filament can be more difficult to see the distinct layer lines and if there were any issues anyway, but these really were super smooth looking parts. A little bit of stringing on some of them, but again, it's PETG, so even the driest and most tuned in settings for PETG can still string a little. But then I figured, why not tackle the most ambitious multicolor print I have ever tried? A full battle droid head in color. To spice things up a little, I decided to go with a commander style color scheme. So you've got the beige, this is technically a really dark gray-green, and then the yellow for the commander design elements. I will link all of these specific colors below for anyone interested. I did make it a point to use about the same type of filament as well, just so that the finish was uniform across the entire piece. You know, I didn't want to accidentally have the yellow be more glossy than the beige or anything like that. Because up until this point, I really hadn't done any three-dimensional multicolor printing, I started off with this smaller plate of just the yellow parts to see if I had all of the purge settings and stuff kind of where they needed to be. And when all of those parts turned out well, I then moved on to the full head, because this was a massive project, both for the amount of filament it was going to have to use to switch between all of these colors, but just it's a large piece in general. And yes, you did see that right. This took almost 79 hours to print, and we did have a bit of an incident with the purge tower falling over. It was very tall because this was quite a tall print, so I really should have made sure that the base was sturdier, either with a raft or just larger at the bottom, but thankfully it did not mess up the print, and all of the little stringy parts I could just peel off. But this was such an impressive print, even though it did nearly kill me to press print on it, just given how much filament waste this did end up creating. Ultimately though, while I always want to showcase the amazing things these machines are capable of making, I also want to highlight the reality of those projects, and in this case it was over a kilogram of purge material. On a slightly more positive note though, other than those two beds of colored pieces, everything else was just a single color, so thankfully no more purge waste. Once I had all of the parts printed, I could then move on to assembling this battle droid head. First off, removing any of the support material. I used organic or tree supports for everything, so they came off pretty easily and also left the undersurfaces quite clean looking. There's a couple of dowels that you print to also help with alignment of the parts so that you can glue them together in place exactly where they need to be. And seeing this battle droid head come together was really cool to see. I know it did take a ton of wasted filament to get it looking to this point, but it is undeniably a very impressive 3D print. I do have to say though, putting some of the barrel nuts into the slots was a bit tight, so I am slightly wondering what the dimensional accuracy is on this printer. It is possibly just because I'm so used to printing these parts in ABS, and the barrel nuts and bolts did fit into all of the slots. It's just I'm used to the fit being a little looser than it ended up being on this particular print. Was it worth an entire kilogram of wasted filament though? I'm not entirely sure, but it is an incredibly impressive print. I am glad I did end up going through with it because it is so clean, it is nearly perfect, and it is really cool to see what these machines are capable of making, even though I personally would not typically be printing something like this outside of one of these test videos. I've put just over 150 hours on the K2 Plus, so I've managed to get a pretty decent feel for the printer, and I wanted to sit down and give you my final thoughts, or at least my thoughts so far for this machine. I have to say, overall, it's been a very positive experience with this printer so far. It's done nothing but work for me right out of the box. There are a couple of glitchy things that I've noticed that I will get into, but in terms of the physical printer working as it should, it has been, and it's been doing a pretty incredible job of it. There are a lot of things that Creality has done very well with the K2 Plus. It is a very impressive machine, and it's going to appeal to a ton of people, especially those that have been waiting for an enclosed printer or a multicolor capable one at that larger build volume. But let's start off with some of the possible trade-offs that come along with this printer. The first thing is, with larger print volume comes great responsibility in terms of filament waste. With the K2 Plus having a 350mm cubed build volume, it is obviously capable of printing quite large pieces, and it could be printing those very large pieces in up to 16 colors, which is going to result in an absolute insane amount of filament waste if you start nearly maxing out its possible build volume. I mean, you've seen in the video just how much filament waste this battle droid had produced, and that was only flipping mostly between two colors. So multiply that by possibly 16 and even possibly a larger piece, and you have a situation on your hands. Technically though, if you are somebody that does a lot of batch multicolor printing, then this machine could start equaling less filament waste. You know, all of a sudden, if you can fit like 10 more of the same object on this larger build plate, it's using the same amount of filament changes for 4 parts as it is 14 parts. On the topic of purge waste, I noticed when I was weighing the excess from the battle droid that there seemed to be a lot of purge bits that looked to be a single color, which mystified me, because obviously the purpose of the purge material is that it is flushing out what is remaining in the nozzle after the machine cuts the one color and then starts feeding in the second. And so the physical purge pieces tend to be 2 colors. Like you can see, oh, here was the old color, this is the color that it switched to. So having very obvious single color purge pieces was like, what was this thing doing? I honestly have no clue if I have footage of this, considering just how long that blasted head took to print, to confirm or deny my theory, but it looks like the machine decided to do like 2 cycles of purge. I am like 95% sure I also decreased the purge calculator because it's sort of like a universal truth that default tends to be overkill for switching between filament colors. So even with me decreasing the amount, it seemed to have still done this. I don't know if it's a default thing that the K2 Plus does, that when it hits a certain threshold, it knows that if it keeps going, it maybe is going to start affecting it appropriately feeding through the chute, and so it does 2 rounds of it. The second round looks like complete overkill though, and so it got me thinking about the nozzle throat length. I know, the things I think about in my free time. If you remember, Creality actually provides a replacement nozzle with this machine, which is great, but it also gave me an example to physically look at the length of this blasted nozzle. So I believe this is one of their unicorn nozzles. I'm not sure if I can find anywhere to confirm or deny the physical parts that this machine uses yet, which is going to be something in a minute we discuss, but this is the nozzle that this machine uses, and you can see it has quite a long throat is what like this whole section is called. It's a long nozzle, clearly. It's a pretty large piece. And you can definitely tell just how long this nozzle is when you compare it to another one. This is a Bamboo Lab X1 nozzle. Clearly a bit of a length difference between these two. And the whole reason I'm even talking about nozzle throat lengths is the filament has to get cut above whatever this assembly part looks like. Now there's probably a bit of space above both of these where the filament is physically cut. It's probably not like exactly like flush with the tops of either of these, but what it does mean is the printers have to 100% always flush out whatever this amount of filament is every single time it does a color change, which means regardless of whatever colors you're having to flip between, whether it's going to purge a little or a lot depending on how similar they are, as just a default measure, this nozzle is going to end up using like 1.5 times the amount of filament of this one just to clear out the nozzle itself, which is obviously not great. Longer nozzles are not inherently a bad thing. Like technically this one should be very resistant to heat creep and should do very well on a high-speed machine because it's so long. But when you're thinking about this nozzle from a multicolor printer standpoint, it's unnecessarily long. You know, when you have a nozzle this long that's doing perfectly fine in terms of heat creep and performing well on a high-speed machine, then having one so much longer is just kind of unnecessary. Now I know the length difference isn't massive, but you are talking about a distance multiplied by possibly hundreds of times on a single print, and that's going to add up to a ton of unnecessary filament waste just from the design. So that was just a theory and an observation. Do with this information what you will, I guess. The next possible trade-off with the K2 Plus, or at least a concern that I have, is with the availability of replacement parts. Like I briefly mentioned with the nozzle, there's like no information as to what parts this machine uses. So I'm guessing by the look of it that it's one of the unicorn nozzles because they do have quite a distinct appearance to them. I've pretty regularly checked up on Creality's website to see what the replacement part situation is for the K2 Plus, and there still is basically nothing. So technically, if that's a unicorn nozzle, you should fairly easily be able to get those, but in terms of any of the other parts, like if you ended up with something that took out more than just the nozzle, needed needed to replace any of the other parts on the hot end, you would be out of luck, it seems. It is actually something that crossed my mind multiple times when I was working on this video, that if I ended up with any sort of print failure that might have accidentally turned into a filament blob or something that started affecting the physical machine, then I was probably going to be out of luck for a decent amount of time, because there are just not those readily available replacement parts that I would have been able to order and have it show up in a week, or just order at all. Forget about the shipping time, just like being able to buy it whatsoever. And every time I talk about replacement parts, I always end it with, hopefully this improves, and I'm not sure if it's improving, Creality. Please, Creality, fix your replacement part situation. Start standardizing the different elements across more of your machines, because I'm pretty sure the K2 Plus has an entirely different like fan shroud hot end cover thing than even like the K1s have. So we're back to even more custom parts that you will seemingly never be able to buy replacements for. And it's just unacceptable, because if one thing goes, then your whole machine is gone, because there's just no hope at fixing anything ever. The only replacement part that I know the website does have are extra build plates, which, not complaining about, I think it's great that there is at least something available for this machine, but I would like to see some other textures become available. The one that's on the printer isn't bad, it worked great for me, but I know a lot of people, including myself, occasionally like to print with a smoother surface depending on the particular project. So hopefully in the future we will see some additional beds being made for this machine. I really don't want to be negative about this printer, because overall I did find it to be a great machine, but there are just things that I have to point out, and one of those are a couple of glitches that I noticed. I mean, Creality Slicer in general, even though it has significantly improved from whatever they called the old version to now the reskinned Orca version, it is a lot better of a slicer. It wasn't creating any unusual artifacts on my prints, but it is still glitchy. Like, the movement mechanics on it would start making the screen like flash white rapidly, and a few other things that didn't exactly scream working and reliable software. Now, as I always mention, I would much rather there be software issues than hardware issues, because software is a whole lot easier to fix than hardware. For this video, I was about 50-50 with slicing with Crealities and Orca. Thankfully, Orca already has a K2 Plus slicer profile available, so that was very easy to set up and use. Creality Slicer overall does work, it's just right now not the most enjoyable software experience, so I wasn't exactly thrilled to be having to use it. And I also wanted to see if there were any differences slicing with Creality Slicer versus Orca. And the one thing that I noticed with both is the estimates are actually way off. Orca kind of gets a pass with this since it's not the native slicer software. It was actually giving me an estimate longer than the prints were physically taking, and it's something that I imagine could possibly be refined to be more accurate, but the inaccurate estimates on Creality Slicer were actually a legitimate problem, because it estimated very wrong the amount of filament that parts were going to be taking. The battle droid head was by far the worst and most notable, which is why I'm bringing it up. You know, an estimate is called an estimate for a reason, but normally estimates are not this far off. Obviously, you pay attention to the filament color estimates to know how much of a filament color it is possibly going to take, and also find out what sort of situation you're getting yourself into with multicolor prints and how much it's wasting. The main head portion of the battle droid estimated that between the tower, the purge material, and the actual piece, it was going to use like around 700 grams of that beige. And these numbers are burned into my brain because I was specifically looking to see if I was going to be able to get away with just a kilogram of the beige filament for all of the pieces. And by the time I'd sliced everything, it was at like 900 and something, so I preemptively purchased a second kilogram of this beige filament. So to my absolute shock, about 85% of the way through that head print, I'm out of beige filament. And we're talking about a print that was supposed to only use 700 grams of said filament. So already we're 300 grams off, but then it continued to use, I think, about a quarter of a kilogram more beyond that. So now we're talking about almost 500 grams off of the estimate. I'm not entirely sure where it's estimating wrong. I'm going to guess the purge material, because that seems to be the thing that it's maybe not the best at calculating. Whatever it is, it needs to be fixed, because like 500 grams off is a lot. That's almost how much the entire print was supposed to take in that color. So again, hopefully this is something that's been fixed already by the time you're watching this. The other glitch is a bit of a fluky thing that I noticed, but right now on whatever firmware this machine is running, if you end the chamber temperature with a 0, it just won't heat up. I thought I was absolutely losing it when I discovered this. For whatever reason, I decided to manually input the chamber heater temperature when I was printing ABS, and I thought 40 degrees sounded like a nice temperature for the parts I was printing. You know, typed the little numbers in, pressed OK, and absolutely nothing happened. So of course I was very concerned that something was wrong with my chamber heater, but I guess somewhere between like pure frustration and laziness, I just decided to input 44 degrees instead, and it worked. I'm not 100% sure if this also ends up being an issue if the chamber heater is already set in the G-code file. I believe I sliced all of my ABS parts in Orca, and I guess I just didn't set the chamber temperature. So it is a weird firmware fluky thing that if your chamber heater seems to not be working, just put it to 41 degrees and be amazed. I know that was a bit of a negative start to my final thoughts, but I really just wanted to lay it out there, all of the things that if you are somebody that is genuinely interested in this printer, that these are some of the issues that you might run into or you might want to think about before purchasing this machine. But now let's talk about all of the things that are actually wonderful about this printer. As I've mentioned and you've seen throughout this video, it has just worked straight out of the box. I have not tinkered with a single thing. All I've been doing in the slicer settings is modifying the infill walls, if it needs support, doesn't, like very basic stuff, none of like the flow of filament. I haven't really been touching the filament temperatures at all, I don't think. But other than that, really no tinkering, and these parts have been looking so impressive straight off of the printer. I know I'm biased, but the logo sign that I started out with was one of the most impressive things to even see being printed. I am well aware how intensely detailed that design is, so seeing it printing on a build plate and doing it perfectly, like there were no lifting edges, it was just a flawless first layer. The battle droid head, even though it did have that slight issue with the purge tower falling over, it still ended up turning out really, really clean and a super cool looking print. I do make a point to try out these machines using various types of filament, and with this being an enclosed printer, it means it is ABS capable, which if you've been here for any length of time, you know that I'm a bit of an ABS fiend. It is what I now make the majority of my props out of because it is so much easier to sand and post-process, but it is one of those more difficult to print with filaments, so you really do need an enclosed machine to start having successful prints. And of course this is a massive printer, so I am thrilled at the possibilities of pieces that I can now print in ABS at that size. This time around I used it on my mortise stone pieces. It is a project that I've been looking at doing for quite a few months. The stones themselves are quite large, even though I did plan on scaling them down from their original size. My plan was always to print them on a large machine, but even then I knew I was going to have to cut them down. So I thought my plan for these pieces was going to have to be using my Cobra 2 Max because it's the biggest printer that I own, but that did unfortunately mean that ABS was out of the question. But then the K2 Plus entered the chat, and yes, it isn't quite as large of a build volume, but I was having to slice the stones down anyway, and I managed to chop them up enough that I could fit them in still very large chunks on this printer, and they are now ABS, which means I probably can complete this project while it is still the winter because I can just acetone smooth these stones down and paint them inside, and it's going to be super fun. I know I started off by highlighting some of the maybe more concerning parts to the design of this machine, but there are also a lot of really well thought out design elements for the K2 Plus. The one that came to mind first was the open PTFE tube design of the CFS. Now I have not personally had to do any maintenance on any of my other AMS units, but I have heard just how annoying it can be because you have to take apart like basically the entire thing to be able to get to the PTFE tubes. So Creality having the PTFE tubes be more of an open on the bottom design, I'm sure is going to be a massive benefit to anyone that has had to deal with the headache of maintenance of those tubes before. Speaking of the CFS, the rollers on the lid seem to do a great job at keeping everything aligned and rolling smoothly. smoothly. There was only one cardboard roll that I put in it that was giving it a bit of trouble. I think it was more so that the spool was just getting really light because it was nearing the end, and that's what was giving it grief. And it was specifically it having to change between colors, and it was the pulling back of filament that it was starting to trigger some errors. But overall, the top rollers seem to be doing a great job at keeping the filament rolls securely in their slots and rolling smoothly. The CFS also has that more unique feature of having a display to show the temperature and humidity of the enclosure. I do have to say though, it does feel like a bit of a missed opportunity to have not also made it a filament dryer. I'd be very interested in all of your opinions on this because I personally am not the biggest user of a filament dryer. It's just never been a massive necessity where I live and like in my workshop. It's always dry enough to keep the filament exactly as it should, but I know there are plenty of people that are very rigorous filament dryer users, and I'm sure it's a bit of a bummer that it isn't like built in so that it's constantly drying your filament as you're printing. The CFS slots of course have the RFID tag reading capability, but I was also pleasantly surprised to see that the external spool holder also has the capability of reading an RFID tag. I've still never put the external spool holder on, and I probably never will, but it is one of those things that on multicolor capable printers, typically the separate external spool has no RFID reading capabilities, and so you will have to manually input the color of filament that you've put on that slot. So having one there is a nice bonus feature that I wanted to mention. The K2 Plus also comes with that hub that means you're able to immediately connect up to 4 CFS units. It's not an additional accessory you have to buy if you want to expand your printing capabilities above 4 filament colors. The bed also heats up like really fast, surprisingly fast, given just how large the machine is. So very pleasantly surprised with that as well. But overall, I'm very happy with this printer. I think it produces incredible prints, and it's going to be a very appealing option for a ton of people. Now, when I bought this machine, there was no option to just order the printer without the CFS unit, and so it did make me think about if I was going to buy this machine now instead of pre-ordering it, would I actually even want the CFS unit? Literally, when I ordered it, this was going to be my first and only multicolor printer I had ever had. That didn't exactly age well. And since this now isn't my only multicolor capable printer, I can really only see myself using the CFS for its automatic refill capabilities. There are some filaments like the rapid PETG that I used for the L3 parts and am typically using for PETG parts that only come in 1 kilogram rolls. So having the AMSs or CFSs or Ace Pros or whatever machine that I'm using be able to automatically switch to the next roll when the one roll runs out is going to be very handy, especially when I am printing constantly for droid parts and things of that nature. And I'm not saying this is a bad multicolor printer by any means, because it has been producing absolutely fantastic results, and I'm sure at some point in the future I will once again use it for some multicolor project, whether that is something that I want that's very large and just decide to sort of suck it up and waste the filament for it, or it is something more along the lines of like a flat large sign that uses hardly any wasted filament because it's only having to do like 6 or 7 filament changes for those first initial layers. But I'm just personally not the biggest user of multicolor printing functionality in the same way that I know a lot of people are. I will always prefer to paint the parts instead of printing them in color. It can be really fun to do, but really the only time that I ever am making things like this battle droid head that are like fully 3-dimensional and all in color are for these review videos to show you realistically, one, what these machines are capable of creating, which is always a great reminder and a fun reminder for me to have, to know that this is a possibility with this technology now. But I also view it more as a realistic look at what the possible trade-off of this multicolor printing is with all of the waste. I guess it's just something to keep in mind, thinking about exactly what you would want to be using this machine for. You know, if you are somebody that never wants to have to worry about replacing filament rolls because you're going through a ton of it all of the time, then the CFS might be something that you should be considering, even if you're planning on never doing multicolor prints. And I too think that I am more on that side, that I am glad that I have the CFS unit as opposed to not having it, so that I do have those capabilities with this machine. It is always less expensive to purchase the CFS or AMS unit with the machine initially than buying one separate, so that might also be a determining factor. I guess just think long and hard about what exactly you you view yourself using this machine for. Because even without its multicolor printing capabilities, it is still an excellent machine that I think is going to be great for a ton of people. As always, if you're interested in finding out even more information about the Creality K2 Plus and CFS units, there will be links in the description box. But that is everything, so thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.